the information I had was the testimony that Conductor Eubanks gave in the court trial. And he told about this interaction with the porter. And then I looked and I researched and found out like what do porters do, where would he be when the train is first leaving, and I painted this picture from taking the information from that, because sadly Mr. Hall did not survive. This gentleman passed away in the train. So I don't know, I don't have his words as to what he was actually doing. But that's an example of what of my method and of how I tell the story. So now we're going to get into a little bit more about how the fact that we were at war helped cause this accident. It's been said that most of the problems suffered by the railroad in 1918 could be traced back to Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany and all the trouble he was making in Europe. A war had raged over there for quite some time, but little more than a year had passed since the United States entered the conflict. Men and women on the home front were still adjusting to the changes brought on by the war. One change had wreaked havoc for Conductor Eubanks and other railroad men throughout the country. In December of 1917, which would have been about 7 months earlier, the Interstate Commerce Commission recommended that the government take control of the railroad industry, and that December, President Woodrow Wilson issued a nationalization order. On March 21st, 1918, which was like 4 months earlier, the Railroad Control Act was signed into law to help move troops and military material. The act put the entire U.S. railway system under the control of the federal government for the duration of the war. Ever since then, the Encino Railway, like most other railways in the country, hadn't been run correctly. Government agents took over management of the railroads, and passengers and workers alike suffered when changes were made to long-held routes and schedules. So what we have is the government has taken over an industry that knew how to run itself, and it made changes that the longtime workers weren't familiar with, and because of that, the trains were overcrowded, people were working longer hours, there was a lot of things in play, and all that led to the disaster that happened at the train wreck. Does anybody have any questions at this point before I go on to the next? Anybody want to ask me questions about the nationalization of the railroads? No? Okay.
They were nationalized for the war.
I'm sorry?
Why were they nationalized?
To help with the war effort so that the government could control and make sure that troops and wartime materials got top priority of movement.
Do you think that had anything to do with the accident?
Yes.
Okay.
The fact that the government was running the railroads, it was just they didn't have the experience that the railroads themselves did over their, like, understanding their routes and their tracks and the people that rode on their train. Yes. Yes, that played a very, I'm glad you asked that question. That's a very good question. She asked me that when I first started reading, I mentioned the women's cars, and at that time there was racial segregation, but there was also gender segregation. When women traveled, when white women traveled, they had the last car on the train was designated a ladies' car. And that kept them, it was for a few reasons. It kept them separated from the company of men. You know, that wouldn't be good to, have to listen to the kind of things men talk about when they're all together on a long trip. And it was also the safest and most comfortable spot on the train because it was at the back, and that meant that you were the furthest from the heat of the smoke, which could be very choking to the people in the front of the train. And and if there was an accident, it's going to suffer the least damage because if it's a head-on collision, you're the furthest from that. Sadly for African American women, they did not have the luxury of that. They were protesting that. There was a lot of women, African American women, that were buying tickets. Like white women would go buy the ticket and then they would give it to an African American woman and she would go and board the ladies' car, and women were being arrested doing that. But they weren't asking to actually ride it with the white women, they just wanted the same privilege of being separated from men and having a more comfortable car. They wanted to be afforded the same courtesies. But that, at this point, had not happened. So sadly, there was about 11 African American women who died because they were in the front cars. The Jim Crow cars where the African Americans rode were all at the front of the train, and that's where most of the deaths occurred and the most severe injuries. So, yes.
Was it wartime nationalization? Did they relinquish it after the war?
5 years after the war ended. And they, the government paid the railroads for any damage that had been done to the rails or to their equipment. So, but they started returning them in 5 years. It took a little bit longer after that. Now I'm going to go back to Mr. Kennedy and read another passage, the one that I started to read before, and you guys were so nice not to laugh at me. But David Kennedy, when I first started researching this story, I just had this thing in my heart for him. He was blamed for causing the wreck. We don't know why. Why he did what he did. He is the one who took the train out onto the single set of tracks. He is the one that disobeyed the order. But he had been with the railroad. He was 78 years old. He'd been with the railroad since he was 22. He'd never been reprimanded. He'd always been a cautious worker. So it's really a mystery as to why this happened. But just human nature. Even though he was a well-respected and beloved person in his community, within 2 hours of the accident, people in Nashville were calling him the blunderer and blaming him for the wreck. And I just thought that was so, for some reason that really just touched me, and I really wanted to clear his name, but sadly, as the facts came in and I researched, there was no way I could twist him around. He was ultimately responsible. I do have to say that. Anyway, and that's his dog, her name was Tiny, according to his granddaughter. Okay, so now where we're at, I'm going to read another little passage just to give you a sense of what the collision was like. And we're going to start out, we're almost to we're near the wreck, the collision's about to happen. Does everybody out here know where White Bridge Road? There's an overpass at White Bridge Road in Harding, but down below it, there's an old bridge that used to be the bridge, and we call it the old bridge now. At this time, it was called the new bridge. It started out being called the new bridge, and then White Bridge Road was called New Bridge Road. And then from about 1919 to 1936, city maps call it Wreck Bridge, and they call what we call White Bridge Road Wreck Bridge Road. And then they started calling it White Bridge in the 30s. And then in the 70s, they built that overpass. And so now the new bridge is the old bridge. So it's just starting in 1915 to now, that's all the different names that bridge has gone by. But it's a pedestrian bridge now. It's at the head of the Richland Creek Greenway, and it's a wonderful little place to go walk. So David Kennedy is almost there. He's gone around the curves. He's coming out. Dutchman's curve was actually a series of S curves. So he's coming out of the last bend in the curve, and then it would be like a straight shot under the bridge. train inside the locomotive cab, David Kennedy guided the train through Dutchman's Curve. Up ahead, the new bridge gleamed. It stood white against the cloudless sky. Kennedy entered the last loop in the bend. The bridge was close. He rounded the bend, and the bridge briefly disappeared from sight again. He could see only a few feet down the tracks as he drove through a blind spot in the curve. Kennedy pulled his rag out of his pocket. He dabbed at the greasy beads of sweat dripping down his forehead as he steered his locomotive around the hill and out of the blind spot. The bridge was now within sight. A curl of smoke rose above it and darkened the sky. Below the swirling funnel of smoke, another locomotive sped under the bridge, thundering down the tracks towards Kennedy as he roared out of the curve. Smoke from the two engines mingled in the air as the locomotives faced each other. Black whirls of heat covered the tracks between them. Kennedy leapt from his stool and jerked the emergency brake. He looked over at Luther Meadows, who was his fireman, and whispered, "Sweet Mother of Jesus," as the smoke from the locomotive in front of them filled their cab. I learned from one of his grandchildren that was something that he said when he was upset. So that's why I put that in there. Kennedy made the sign of the cross across his chest, lifted his arm to cover his face, and leaned back to brace for the crash. He uttered a prayer for the dead as the steel beams framing the head of his engine struck the head of the locomotives in front of him. 160 pounds of iron, 160 tons of iron slammed together as the two locomotives crashed into each other, meeting head-on. Burning coals from the fireblocks flew through the cabs as the force of the impact propelled the two steel beasts straight up and into the air. Scalding hot water spilled down to the ground as the boilers ripped off the driving wheels below. The bubbling cauldrons fell to the cornfield in an explosion of steam and boiling spray. So that's how I imagined a person would respond with what I knew about him. And I talked to people who had been in steam locomotives, you know, like the dabs of sweat and stuff. That's how I painted that picture of that accident, of the collision. So that's how I explain my method. So let's see, and that's a picture from the taken from the bridge. That picture's taken from the bridge, looking down, probably about noon. You can see in the background where that smoke's coming up. That's a wrecker car that's come from Union Station, and it's one by one pulling the train cars back to the shops. Yes, sir.
So, I want to make sure. So, Mr. Kennedy pulled onto the single track, leaving there the holding area. Who gave him instruction? Was it Mr. Eubanks, the conductor?
Mr. Eubanks, and his question was who gave the order that they were supposed to wait. So before they left Union Station, they went down to the telegraph office, and that's where they have the latest information of what's happening up and down the tracks. And so the orders were for them to wait at the shop area for the number one train to come in from Memphis, and then when it came by, for it to go up to the train station that was at Belle Meade Plantation, about maybe a mile from here, and pick up some mail from the local Waverly train that was coming in from, I guess, the west. And so those were his orders. They were issued by the superintendent at the railroad, and how it would work is, say you're the conductor and I'm the engineer. You're handed the order, you read it out loud to me, and then you hand it to me, and I read it back out loud to you. So we're all on it, and we do this in front of other people. So that was just railroad procedure. So we're all on the same page that we both know what we're supposed to do. Because, did I say you're the engineer? or if you're the conductor, you're at the back of the train, and I'm the engineer, I'm at the front of the train. And at that point, you really couldn't communicate with each other. They didn't have radio systems and walkie-talkies or any way to communicate. Yes?
So how many cars were on each train coming towards?
The train coming from Memphis, at the back of it, there was 2 Pullman sleeper cars, because it was an overnight train. It left Memphis the night before. And then there was 2 what they called regular cars, that's what they called them. It was for white men. And then there was 2 Jim Crow cars, which is where the African American people were. And then there was 2 baggage cars on the one. On the one coming from Nashville, there was the ladies' car at the back. There was 3 regular cars, 1 Jim Crow car, and then there was 2 baggage cars, and then it also had a mail car at the very front. So it went mail car, baggage car, Jim Crow cars, regular cars. And this was the train. This was the one where the 2 at the front, the baggage people died, the mail people died, and most of the people in the Jim Crow cars died. Yes?
What is the theory as to why the engineer decided not to follow orders?
Well, when Mr. Eubanks, the conductor who survived, was in court, he testified that while he was gathering tickets, he saw something with steam go by. And they thought that maybe it was like just a train that had picked up some empty cars and had passed them by. And so some people believe that Mr. Kennedy mistake, took those cars for the number 1. Thank you. But I also think that, of course, here I am. I'm still trying to make excuses for him. I'm the great enabler. I think maybe he had a medical. He was in his 70s, and perhaps he had a medical event. I don't know. But that is the only reason people have come up with, that they have floated, that he would that he had mistaken this little car that was moving other cars, this other locomotive, for the number 1.
So he was the sole person responsible for moving.
Well, see, and that's where it really gets kind of tricky, because there was 2 firemen in the front with him too, and his wife's lawyer kind of threw them under the bus in the court case, saying that maybe he wasn't responsible, maybe they should have been looking better. So, people are people. Yes, ma'am.
With his 50-plus years experience, wouldn't he know? Oh, thank you.
Oh, thanks, Jeff.
With his 50-plus years experience, wouldn't he know what the number 1 train looked like?
Yes.
And wait for it to pass?
Yes. The number 1 was being pulled by the twin sister of his locomotive. He was in 201 and that was 202, and they were identical. They were bought at the same time. They came off the assembly line, within hours of each other. So they were familiar with each other.
So it's a mystery.
Yeah, it is a mystery. Somebody over here.
Yeah, have you been approached about any movie offers?
A lot of people have ideas, but everyone says it should be a movie, but that's out of my abilities. I've had a couple people offer to do it, and then I never heard from them anymore. So it's hard to say. But I think that it would make I of course think it would make a wonderful story.
What happened to the wreckage? Is the wreckage anywhere where we can see it? Or?
No. Okay. What happened was, this is really interesting. It was considered, the locomotives were described as demolished in the newspapers, but they took them back to the shops, which is over by where by Centennial Park. It was near where Centennial Park is now. And that was a huge railroad complex, and they had people that could do just about anything there. And they rebuilt the locomotives, and they went back into service, and one of them was destroyed out at the Radnor Yards in the 30s, but the other one ran until the 1940s, and it was just hauling trash in Atlanta was its last little duty, and then they just scrapped it. But they take, even at that point, they don't just throw them away. They take all the parts and they melted everything down and they built something else out of them. Somebody over here had a question?
Yeah, could you talk about the financial settlement, specifically the Ferris family?
I'm sorry?
The financial settlement, the Ferris family was awarded a fairly sizable amount of money, according to the plaque down there, that was seed money for Third National Bank.
Yeah, the families kind of asked me to shy away from that question because there's sort of... But what I can say, from my own opinion, is I've seen what the settlements were, and I don't think there would be enough to be a seed money for a bank. It's the average settlement for a white man, and Mr. Ferris would have been on the high end of that because he was a businessman, was $11,000 of 1918 money or 1920 money, I think, when they finally got it. And the average for an African American male was about $1,100. So, but the $11,000 represents about $28,000 in our time, in our money. So I really don't know, but Mr. Ferris said it in the newspaper. Mr. Frank Ferris said that in the newspaper. So, but they were very helpful to me when I established the marker. The Ferris Foundation contributed a good percentage of the money to pay for the establishment of the marker because Mr. Ferris was on the train. Interesting story about Mr. Willis Ferris. I didn't write about him in my book. Some people, they were just too big. I couldn't, to tell their story would have just distracted a lot. But he was on his way to Memphis to buy some high-grade Russian hardwood for one of the undertakers in Nashville wanted to make some very high-end caskets. So that's just one of those weird little stories that turned out to be true with some research. Yes, ma'am.
Practice of uncoupling the cars when they cross the Mason-Dixon line to separate black and white. Was that going on at that time?
I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think that would have been the case because I think that segregation was pretty much nationwide at that time. Maybe later on, but sadly I think segregation did not go away just when you crossed the Mason-Dixon line. I just don't think it was as big of a crime, perhaps. Yes.
Have you seen any reports or have you undertaken to do an accident reconstruction to see how fast those trains were going on impact?
Well, I haven't, but I know somebody who did. And according to the ICC report, which was written and released within 6 weeks of the accident, both trains were going about 55 miles an hour, so they called it a combined speed of 110 miles an hour. I personally question that because the train that was coming from Union Station was getting ready to stop at Harding, which was about 1.5 miles away. So I don't know that it would have actually been going 55 miles an hour. And the train coming from Memphis had just come down 9 Mile Hill, so it was probably going really fast. It had all that momentum of coming downhill. But the official report is it was a combined speed of 110. Yes, where are we going? Oh, okay, hi.
Hi. Can you tell us what we know about the search and rescue situation that happened and the response, and maybe any lessons learned in that area?
That's a great question. That's one of my favorite things to talk about. The first people who arrived on the scene were the neighborhood people. And they just came out with whatever tools and abilities that they had and just started pulling people out. the sisters from St. Mary's Orphanage right there, they came down and they were offering aid. They were taking people who were lightly injured up to the orphanage where they waited, just to kind of get them away from everything, where they could get cleaned up and rested. The West Nashville had a very large bootlegging community. They said the bootleggers came out with their whiskey and were giving people whiskey for relief, and that the police that were there just turned a blind eye to that. The accident happened at about 7:10. By 9 o'clock, the Red Cross relief train arrived, and the Nashville chapter of the Red Cross had just been established like 3 months earlier, but they'd already bought a train car and had it full of medical supplies, blankets, places to store ice, cots, everything that they needed, and it was filled with doctors and nurses. Almost every doctor and nurse was, they said, pressed into duty and was brought out there by 9 o'clock. So a lot of people that were injured were given medical treatment on the site. For the people who were dying, they were just, people tried to make them as comfortable as possible. There's lots of stories of people just sitting with other people and talking to them. There's one story of one Red Cross worker talking to a man while he's dying, getting his mother's address so she could write him a letter, because people in the country, he lived in the country and they didn't have a telephone. So there's also women from the Red Cross were given money to go out and buy flags. They came out and covered the bodies of all the military people who had been killed at the site. But Dr. Duncan Eve Jr. was the railroad physician, and he was in charge of overseeing everything. But there was another doctor, Dr. William Buckner, who anybody here who's probably knows who, there's probably people here who know who Ridley Wills is. It was Ridley Wills' grandfather. And he was out there, he was a doctor, and he lived on West End, and he was one of the first to arrive. So there was a lot of, and they said that people ignored race. It didn't matter, people were just rescuing whoever they could, however they could.
Got time for one more question, I think.
Hello. You mentioned at the beginning that the nationalization of the railroad had something to do with this, and you felt like it contributed to it. I'm over here.
Oh, okay.
I think you kind of covered this. Was it just reduction in workforce? You said nationalization calls for all.
I didn't really cover the reduction in workforce, but that was a really huge part because of the draft. Men between the age of 19 and 35 were being drafted, and so a lot of the able, experienced railroad people had been taken out of the workforce. But the other thing was just that the government had taken over, and they, we've all had that job where somebody buys your company or someone new comes in, a new manager, and they got to change everything about how you do it. Like, no, don't walk through that door, walk through that door. And that was just one of it. So everything was being changed, and it was just very disruptive to the employees, and they were not happy about it. Did I answer your question? All right. And there was somebody over here that's been trying to, maybe not, maybe she left.
We have one more question.
Okay. And then we'll stop, Jeff? Is that what you're going to stop? Okay.
Well, it's a great story. Let's give Betsy a round of applause. And it's a big story, and there's so much to be told on it. And I'm sure Betsy will stick around. She's also going to be selling and signing her books over here. And so please join us with her books. And don't forget, next month is a topic we'll all be interested in. We will have Dr. William Teets here from Vanderbilt University. He will speak. Dr. Teets is an astronomer, and he will be speaking to us about the solar eclipse